The battle for recognition of ELL's education.
1954 Brown v. Board of Education. The case outlawed segregated schools, deeming them inconsistent with equal education. It all started when ELL parents claimed discrimination through the equal treatment regulations in English-majority schools. They believed that schools took on the equal treatment policy literally, which limited success in ELL students' academics. The ELL students were placed in English-only speaking classrooms, which was seen as equal treatment, and were falling behind because of their inability to understand English. J. Stanley Pottinger, director of the Office of Civil Rights, sent a message demanding that they offer some type of special language instruction for children that needed help in English. The case ruling was that American state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools were deemed unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools were otherwise equal in equality. The students were to receive communication from administrators in a language that they could understand. The impact on the ELLs were that the ELL students weren't understood as they could not understand/speak English. Educators saw discrimination as physically treating the students differently, as allowing them equal instruction meant equal education. This case helped establish that ELL students need a separate instruction in their native language before transitioning into a majority English-speaking classroom. 1964 Civil Rights Act passes Congress. The act stated the concept of equality in federal law. Parts of the act that pertained to the ELL students was Title IV of the act that called for desegregation of public schools, Title V of the act that broadened the duties of civil rights commissions, and Title VI of the act that stated any person participating in any program receiving federal financial assistance could not be discriminated against on the basis of race or natural origin. Impact on ELLs. Although there were some ELL students who qualified for federal funding to receive special assistance in their academics, there was a higher percent of students who didn't qualify for those programs. For the students who received funding, it was beneficial since the government funded the schools participating in the equal education programs, and the schools had to abide by the rules or they'd be fined and dock the money they received from the grants. However, again, for the ELL students that were not under any funding programs, equal education was still pretty much non-existent as the schools overlooked the act. 1968 Bilingual Education Act becomes law. This was the first commitment to assist students with limited English skills. The act provided funds through grants directly to school districts. These grants were to be used for resources for educational programs, training for teachers and teachers' aides, development and dissemination of materials, and parent involvement in the projects. However, it did not require the schools to use a language other than English in order to receive the funding. Once becoming a law, it was aimed at the students who were poor and educationally disadvantaged because of their inability to speak the English. The impact on the ELLs. There was obviously fundamental issues with this act, however, it was a step in the right direction. The ELL students were lacking resources, teachers, and parent involvement well before this act was established. With the passing of this act, the ELL students received more recognition and understanding for their language disadvantage. 1974 Federal Appeals Court in Serna v. Portales Municipal Schools. This lawsuit was established by Mexican American parents in New Mexico, and it eventually led to the first court mandate for bilingual education. It was argued that the school did not follow regulations set under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and natural origin in any program that receives federal funding. The court found that the school's program for these students was insufficient and did not meet standards. The judge ordered that instruction be given in the child's native language and culture as part of the desegregation plan. Upholding that decision 2 years later, it was ruled that Title VI of Elementary and Secondary Education Act gave Hispanic students a right to bilingual education. Impact on ELLs. As regulations and acts were set in place previously, none of them required ELL students to be taught in any language other than English. That was the main battle since all of this equality protest started. This court case allowed for the ruling that ELL students get the right to bilingual education. They would now be recognized as receiving specialized instruction in their own native language. 1974, the unanimous Supreme Court decision in Lau v. Nichols. This was presented in 1970 because of a failing Chinese student who was unable to understand the language of instruction. The claim was that the child was being denied education on equal terms because of their limited English skills, which was the standard agreed upon in the Brown v. Board of Education case. San Francisco school officials stated that all students received the same instruction, which was equal education, and if the students had a language deficiency that enabled them to understand, then that was their own problem. Federal districts and
Appeals sided with the school officials. The Supreme Court overruled it, however, referring back to the Title VI under the CRA, stating that the Chinese students should have been granted special instruction in their native language. San Francisco officials signed a consent agreement to provide bilingual education for the city's Chinese, Filipino, and Hispanic children. This led to the Lau remedies, in which were guidelines that told districts how to identify ELL students. The impact on ELLs. This court case emphasizes the diversity of ELL students and that it's not discriminated against only one culture, but there are several. The Lau remedies were established and understood between districts, and that actions must be followed through when students meet certain requirements, those of the Lau remedies. Now, the districts were able to get printed guidelines on how to identify ELLs rather than assuming, and more importantly, assuming incorrectly. 1974, Congress passes Equal Education Opportunities Act. This act prohibits discrimination against faculty, staff, and students, including racial segregation of students, and requires school districts to take action to overcome obstacles regarding students' equal participation. This affected the education of the ELL students by specifically mentioning that language barriers were to be overcome by instructional programs. This act also extended the Lau remedies to all students in school districts, not only to those receiving federal funds. The impact on the ELLs. Just as the title of the act states, equal education opportunities. Opportunities, as some schools chose to abide by the regulations and requirements, while other schools did not. There was no push for the success of ELL students, only extended funding. Some of the ELL students receive benefits through the exemption of funding as they become eligible for programs. However, there were no foundations set in the ELL classrooms. In 1974, the Bilingual Education Act was reauthorized for the first time. The act was modified with the emphasis on 1. The definition of the bilingual education program, 2. The program's goals, 3. The involvement of support centers, and 4. The population efforts, growth-wise. The impact on the ELLs was that the modifications of the act supported the ELL students and their education. Before, the acts missed some requirements and or didn't go into detail about what requirements stated really meant. For the schools who were hesitant in changing educational standards for ELL students, the qualifications on this act really pinpoints what needs to be followed and to what extent. In 1978, the Bilingual Education Act was reauthorized for a second time. These modifications extended the act and broadened the definitions of eligible students. The goals were addressed on behalf of the transitional bilingual education programs. 1. The program was to prepare ELL students to enter the regular English-speaking classes as quickly as possible, and the native language was only to be used if needed for communication. 2. The program was designed only to maintain the native language, which was excluded from receiving funding. And 3. Reading and writing skills were added to the program's goals, rather than only English instruction, to further enable ELL students to become proficient in the English curriculum, not just speaking English as the language. The act addressed the problem of national origin desegregation by allowing up to 40% enrollment of English-speaking children in the bilingual programs as a way to assist the ELL students in learning English. The way this impacted the ELLs was, although the overall goal was to have the ELL students proficient in the English language, the reauthorization of the act for the second time seemed to limit the students. Each ELL students have their own pace, and the regulations in the act result in a rush of transitioning. Also, maintaining of the native language is important, so the fact that it was no longer funded created tension between the government and the ELL community. 1981 Federal Appeals Court in Castaneda versus Pickard. The court case originated in Texas when Castaneda complained that his daughter's rights were violated by Raymondville ISD because the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Educational Opportunities Act don't allow educational institutions to exclude students of educational opportunities based on sex, color, race, or national origin. Castaneda points out that the EEOA guarantees ELL students the right to equal treatment, to access the school's instructional program, and extra support to help them learn English as quickly as possible. The EEOA also prohibits discrimination among employees and staff, which was also brought up in the case. Castaneda also stated that the district did not help students with language barriers because of the lack of development of their bilingual programs in the district. The result of the ruling was in favor of the school district, stating that the rights of the children were not being violated. Therefore, Castaneda appealed the ruling. Federal courts finally realized that the district was not meeting standards, so the three-pronged test was created to tell whether or not school districts were meeting the needs of the ELL students. The impact on the ELLs. This case calls for full recognition of ELL students and their qualifications regarding the programs that they are placed in. As I mentioned before, the ongoing battles of whether the ELL student needs are being met are danced around and often dismissed. Now, schools are receiving all these qualifications and list of requirements and guidelines that need to be met for the ELL students in the bilingual programs. Not only do the schools now consider ELL students as part of the education population, but now, whether they like it or not, they are required to include the ELL students in all academic aspects. In 1984, the Bilingual Education Act was reauthorized for the third time. The third round of modifications to the Act allowed grants to be awarded for several types of special programs for ELL students, some including the Transitional Bilingual Education Program, the Developmental Bilingual Education Program, and the Special Alternative Instructional Program. There was a call to action for parents and guardians to be more involved in the education of the ELL students. Grants were also given for programs to include family services. One of the programs was the Family English Literacy Program that was created to offer instruction in English language to parents on how to assist the ELL students in their academics. The final impact was that the ELL students finally gain a spot in the education world. Education has evolved to meet the needs of the ELL students who work hard just like any other student.